Hello and welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study, both to the Sunday morning group that meets live and those that might be connected virtually at different times. Today is our final lesson on the Epistle to the Hebrews. It involves some final exhortations given to this Hebrew audience and is followed then by a benediction and greeting similar to what we see with the Pauline letters, especially the Pauline letters that are not considered genuine Pauline. This lesson covers chapter 12, starting in verse 18, and goes to the end of the book, which is chapter 13. I will forego the oral reading here today, but urge you to read it on your own. The last half of chapter 12 is considered by many scholars to be the actual climax of this epistle. It's a natural ending, and they believe it was the ending of the sermon series as presented by the original author. He uses two extended metaphors in it, one of Mount Sinai and the other of Mount Zion. Mount Sinai refers to the earthly and first covenant system, while Mount Zion is the Jerusalem in heaven, the eschatological goal of Christians and Jews that accept the new covenant system, and warns them to see that to be sure that they do not refuse the offer that's made to them. It is because Mount Zion, as they see it, the city where heavenly Jerusalem is a symbolic thing representing this is where God actually is. This main point seems to be that the earthly system pictured Israel's early experience in the old system, where God was distant from them and inaccessible to them, leaving them terrified and unfulfilled longing, as one puts it. The author places his audience, Hebrew audience here, among the pilgrims from the old system who have come to Zion instead of to Sinai, and are in the heavenly festival that is symbolized by the fall holy day season in the Jewish calendar, called the Feast of Booths or Feast of Tabernacles. Both God and Jesus Christ are present with them. Thus he seems to be counting his audience among the firstborn to be ready for judgment by God, with Jesus there as their mediator. Scholars note here that in some of the oldest 5 versions of the New Testament, Mount Sinai is not specifically named there in chapter 12, verse 18. It is in other places, but the idea is wherever it mentions the mountain there in verse 18, most scholars feel it's referring to Mount Sinai and the old system symbolically. So your Bible translation may not name that mountain, but most Bible scholars are in good agreement that the author here is referring to Mount Sinai and the story that's outlined in Deuteronomy and Exodus. The author clearly presents the idea that the forms God appears in to them under the old system was terrifying to humans and was unbearable to the human psyche. They begged of God not to speak to them, as it was too terrible and fearful to bear, which is the story of Exodus 20. Dr. Craddock says the idea Hebrews presents is that the conditions under which the old covenant was given and operated were dread, fear, exclusion, and inaccessibility to God. Several scholars say when we place them as pilgrims at the new heavenly temple, referred to as Zion here, or Mount Zion, he is speaking in eschatological time or terms, and not the present time and terms. That is the future end of the age time is what he's talking about, what he's referring to, and using Zion to symbolize that, and which was celebrated annually in the fall feast of Tabernacle, or Booths as it's sometimes referred, as the future expected event by Israelites and Jews. This festival was a happy time, and thus there is no evidence here that they seem fearful, though it depicts the final judgment, scholars add. Why? Because the idea had long stood in Judaism that those who trust God and are obedient have no fear of judgment, have no fear of Judgment Day. Scholars say implied here is the second covenant provides even more assurance of Christ, and is in reality where all can easily come to that. After all, your mediator is there with you at the judgment time. That mediator is Christ. Up to chapter 13, Hebrews is not an epistle or letter. But starting in chapter 13, what it is up to that point is a series of sermons. But suddenly in chapter 13, the style shifts from an epistle, to an epistle from a sermon. Scholars, especially some scholars, they don't all agree with, that the style does not mean that the author of chapter 13 is necessarily different from those in 12. But others would say it is likely that this is a completely different author, that this represents, and starting in chapter 13, is very much Paul-like in the writings, and it appears to be an attempt to imitate Paul. The first 6 verses are exhortations concerning, that is starting in chapter 13, concerning mutual duties of Christians and reassurance of confidence in faith that God and Christ will not forsake them. They are to have mutual love for those in the faith, as well as to show hospitality to strangers. A strong message is there to remember the prisoners, for which most scholars suggest this prisoner here is not all prisoners or prisoners in general, but those who are in prison because of their faith, because they're Christians, and not necessarily, as I said, the general population. All that said, those opening things, that's very consistent with Paul's teachings throughout his genuine Gospels. Whereas much of what's been said up to this point is not, although it may be consistent, is not sounding like Paul. Suddenly now in chapter 13, this is sounding like Paul. One of those exhortations is a strong focus on marriage and a particulars of sexual relationships of marriage, says several scholars, using the term the marriage bed. This is not an advocacy for celibacy, as some might have used it, they claim. It instead is one to abstain from adultery in marriage. Then in verse 5 comes a big one that society wrestles with. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. Scholars do not provide much guidance to what triggers this warning other than the greed commandment, but it's definitely not been part of what the discussion has been up to this point in Hebrews. Seems totally foreign here. Dr. Harold Attridge at Yale says, don't miss that this greed warning that's here, that's what he refers to it as, is tied to where you place your trust, not in money, but in God's promise not to forsake you. So this is more about where your trust lies eschatologically than it is about how much money you have or do not have. Some suggest all these final points are general warnings for society here that do not necessarily reflect any particulars of this audience or even what Hebrews has been talking about up to this point, other than maybe the tie to faith. This is followed by advice to follow their leaders and Christ, and a famous line in verse 8 that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Some scholars argue this implies concern for Christian martyrdom, but most say likely not. It seems to be more of a call for fidelity to the faith and simply nothing more than fidelity to the faith, many scholars would add. The writer then revisits in verse 9 through 6 Christ's sacrifice as it relates to the sacrifice for sin, but with a warning not to get carried away with strange teachings and heresies. How this is connected to the Hebrew audience is unclear, and it seems not to be necessarily connected with the first 12 chapters. Thus it seems more like some of Paul's comments to the Corinthians rather than something that belongs in Hebrews. Then in verse 17 through 19, the writer urges them to obey their leaders, again sounding like Paul here, very much so like Paul. Leaders surfaces 3 times here in this chapter without surfacing a single time in the first 12 chapters of Hebrews. There is no indication of any such problem with this Hebrews audience of following leadership, like we saw in Corinthians, for example. It is this Paul sounding items in chapter 13 that has led the church historically, many think, to credit Paul with the writer of Hebrews. Yet scholars feel that the majority of it is not written by Paul. Because this clearly sounds like Paul in chapter 13, but nothing like Paul in the other 12, many suggest that this is maybe even added on, that chapter 13 is added on. How did that happen? The letter is closed in verses 22 through 25 with a classic greeting and farewell similar to those in any of the Pauline letters. The mention of Italy and Timothy caused many scholars to suggest it is there to tie the letter to the Pauline circle in some areas. Others suggest it may be a reference to it being sent to some group of Hebrews in Italy or to some group in Italy. Craddock taught that a major school of thought is that the Pauline school in Rome modified records of sermons that were given anywhere in Christendom at the time by adding a Pauline extension to them and sharing them with other churches, and that this is how some of the non-genuine Pauline letters surface. And they believe that this may very well, the book of Hebrews in chapter 13 may be a classic example of that. There is evidence also in other writings that the same school picked up other Greco-Roman writings too that was sent to the churches, but were not necessarily considered by the canon committees to be canonable material, and therefore did not survive. The Epistle of Hebrews, thus, seems a proper title. Several people summarize this: Epistle to the Hebrews, which you recall was written on the outside of one of the earliest manuscripts, rather than as a title per se. But they say that seems like an appropriate title. This book, for the most part, was written to the Hebrews. Say, and its body was written to those with a Judeo-Christian background. To such people, a core issue would have been clarification of the sacrificial system that they were brought up under. They probably had a hard time, as did Paul, accepting the new covenant concept until they could understand how the old system had been replaced. Hebrews' aim seems to be a series of sermons to that effect, with the addition of a Pauline closure to make it available to all Christians and not just to a Hebrew audience, is where one scholar closes with it. I hope this is of some help to you in trying to understand what is available here in Hebrews. This has been a difficult book for us to study, a lot of foreign concepts to us, but I think we've, with the help of a number of scholars, especially Dr. Craddock and Dr. O'Brien and Dr. Hagner, and Dr. Attridge, these all have helped us helped me especially gain enough insight into it that I can hopefully pass on some of this to you. And so thanks for being here, and hopefully we'll see you again in another Bible series.